Welcome, and thanks for listening to Intrinsic Investigations. My name is Mr. Olivo, and I created this podcast because I've been fortunate enough over the last decade to see unique and thought-provoking projects happen in my classroom, and we wanted a place to showcase them. The true heart of this podcast lies not in the content discovered, but in exploring the personal stories of these young researchers as they journey through uncharted and unfamiliar intellectual terrain. By sharing their stories, we hope to normalize the challenges and frustrations that come with independent research, and also share those moments where students transcend the normal grind of the school day to discover concepts that range from the global to deeply personal. We will begin with a brief introduction to the student of focus, why they picked their topic, and discuss their growth over the course of the last year. It should be mentioned that the opinions expressed in this podcast in no way reflect the opinions of our school district, Bergen County Technical Schools and Special Services, or our school itself, Bergen County Technical High School, Teterboro, or the College Board. The work detailed in this podcast was most likely completed in AP Capstone, but this podcast is in no way affiliated with the College Board. This episode also features two students, and I think they're in law and justice as well. That's weird. We got teamwork going on in the law and justice major at our school. All right, Andrew, you want to introduce yourself? Let's get this rolling.
Yeah, so my name is Andrew. I'm a junior in the law and justice major here at Bergen Tech, and I did a mixed method content analysis on American fans' perceptions of instances of cultural appropriation on X.
And the person to your left would be?
My name is Jeffrey Bagan. I'm also a law and justice major here at Bergen Tech. I'm also a junior, and I did a qualitative thematic analysis on English-speaking audiences and their perception of sportswashing among Arabian Peninsula countries and their investments.
Both of you chose X.
Yep.
Andrew, let's start with you. Why did you choose X to try to explore K-pop in the way that you explored it?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to this. So the first answer is the professional research answer, where it's my source, Meshlin Shin, talks about how online spaces like X and online discussion sites have been integral to the growth of K-pop on the global music stage, right?
Okay.
And so that's the research answer and the basic answer I gave in my research paper. But also, there's a personal answer where it's on TikTok, on just on the internet, I see so much activity and discussions around cultural appropriation. For example, Tarzan is this K-pop idol who is kind of in the realm of cultural appropriation, and so he pops up on TikTok all the time. And so that's kind of the two reasons why I chose X. So.
Okay. All right, we'll dig a little deeper in there. And Jeffrey, why did you pick X?
So obviously, similar answer. A lot of my scholarly literature, basically all my sources, it's common among the literature to be using X because I think it just has the most data in terms of serious responses, because as I found looking through other sources such as Reddit and other social media platforms, it just had the most amount of serious and useful discourse when relating it to my research.
So in that case, the sampling for you was purposive. You wanted to use X for a very particular reason because I guess in a way you knew you would find what you were looking for there?
Yeah, so I did employ a purposive sampling method, and I could go deeper into that, but I did, used Twitter filters to pick and choose the tweets I specifically wanted to my study and that were related to my study.
Either of you could jump in on this question. Do either of you remember a life where Twitter or X didn't exist? I'm just trying to...
Yeah, I don't think I was born at that time. I think I was still...
Same answer, I don't remember it then.
Let's just pull up real quick when Twitter was founded.
It's probably early 2000s. Is it 2004? I don't know.
Something like that.
It was 2006.
Yeah.
So that's... Yeah, that's 10 years ago, so that puts both of you, you're 6 years old.
Wait, 2006?
2006. Oh my gosh, 2006.
We were 3 years before.
I've got Monday brain. Wow, I was making 2016. Yeah. So this is 20 years ago. Neither of you have known a world that doesn't have Twitter.
Yeah.
No.
All right, so I'm going to play a little game then.
Okay, we got this.
We're
We got
gonna
this.
We're gonna
Okay.
do a word association game. I say we'll use the current iteration of Twitter, which is now X, made 20 years ago, just to correct myself from my bad math. Either of you can jump in. When you hear X, what are 3 words that pop into your head?
All right, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Elon, black, and I don't know, like Republican.
Okay.
I think of tweet, post, and purchase.
Tweet
That
post.
is so lame.
Tweet,
that?
all right.
Tweet,
no,
post?
He doesn't need your judgment right now. All right, tweet, post, purchase. Okay, so those first 2 are obviously related to just the mechanics of the platform, and the purchase, I'm assuming, is that a hint to Elon Musk's acquisition?
Yeah, it was towards the acquisition of Twitter and changing it into X.
Okay, Andrew, you have Elon, black, Republican. So what are those things?
Elon is obviously
The
like
purchaser.
Yeah, Elon
He's
Musk.
the owner.
Black because X, like Twitter was blue, but now it's like black. It's
Oh,
black
that's true.
X,
That's true.
right?
The color change.
And what Republican because like I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of controversy around X, surrounding that. It's kind of favoring like far right or at least conservative voices. I don't know if that's true. I haven't like researched it, but that's like what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing online. So
There's a sentiment.
there's a widespread sentiment. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually wanted to add to that. So when I was doing my research, something I found very interesting is the very first post I found when I researched sportswashing, they were all very conservative leaning, and what I mean by this is they were all very rude and sort of racist in the language they used. So they all mentioned, like, when I was investigating sportswashing, it was more like instead of critiquing sportswashing, it was more get out of our country language and rhetoric, which I found very interesting because this was on a fresh Twitter account. I'd never used it before. I made a brand new account for this, and the very first post I found was quite racist.
Okay, so rude and nationalistic to the point of being racist. Like, this is our country, this is our land, like, get out.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and I guess, yeah, well, is that going to be a factor in either of your work? Andrew, I probably am, I'm anticipating not so much, but
like racist kind of.
like nationalistic sentiment or
Yeah. So
prejudicial statements like that.
like one of my scholarly sources, I think it was like 2014, talks about cultural purity, and that's more in the Korean context, where it's like a lot of Korean K-pop fans are kind of, they don't like the cultural hybridity, the cultural hybridization that K-pop has underwent, because they prefer more local traditional sounds and like, you know, K-pop staying Korean,
Okay.
quote unquote. But from my findings on X, I don't think there was a single tweet that mentioned cultural purity. And I think I mentioned that in my paper, where it's kind of interesting how the racial sensitivity among American audiences kind of positions them to, I guess, criticize K-pop more rather than defend it. Because I didn't see a lot of defense for K-pop. in that
All right,
regard.
let's get into the specifics. Your work, if you could sum up in 2 sentences, Andrew, what your work is about, and then we're going to focus on Jeffrey and kind of bring them back together. So just for the 2 of you and for the audience, it's probably going to be about a good 5 minutes for each of you, and then we'll try to synthesize what you were looking at. What is your work about, Andrew?
Just like a summary of like,
like-
my findings, like what I was looking for, like.
Yeah, what were you trying to do? Let's start
Yeah.
with what was your goal? What were you trying to explore?
So my goal was, as I mentioned before, I've seen on TikTok and there's a lot of sentiment and like discussion about cultural appropriation in K-pop. And so initially I wanted to look at, you know, is this cultural appropriation valid? Or like, are these K-pop groups or that are under fire for cultural appropriation kind of like actually appropriating black culture, right?
All right, let's pause real quick. Just
Yeah.
if people aren't familiar with K-pop and what you're describing, the problem is that there is a sentiment that
Yeah.
K-pop artists, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in general, tend to culturally appropriate like African American hip hop in the United States,
Yeah.
and then kind of put it in their
Kind of,
music.
yeah. It's like the problem, or like the sentiment more or less is kind of like the K-pop music industry as a whole is kind of incorporating, because K-pop is an inherently hybrid genre. That's what O 2014, Kim 2017 establishes, right? And so since it's a hybrid genre, it's basically an amalgamation of like a bunch of different genres into one with like some Korean aesthetics mixed in, right? And so with this comes a separation of that music from their originating culture. And so in the instance of Black culture, there's hip-hop, R&B, funk. And so when K-pop incorporates this, a lot of American audiences or international audiences see it as appropriation because they're disconnecting it from the deep racial roots that R&B and hip-hop come from and kind of using it as a commercial aesthetic tool. And so that's kind of the sentiment that I saw initially before and after in my results part 2. And so, yeah, so as I mentioned before, initially I wanted to observe like whether the cultural appropriation was valid, but obviously there's a lot of scholarly work on that. So instead I pivoted to look at the sentiment and see how does that sentiment impact the cultural legitimacy of K-pop. And I think, Mr. Oliva, you're like kind of familiar with this because initially in my cultural like legitimacy search process, there wasn't a lot on it, or like I couldn't find a lot on it, right? And so I had to ask a professor from North Carolina, Professor von Schmutz, and he basically gave me like a few sources on basic theories of cultural legitimacy, which I then applied to the tweets that I thematically analyzed. And so through that process, I was able to find, I think it was like 10 themes-ish, 10-ish themes.
10-ish themes, yeah.
Right, and I then also created, and that was inductively, so it was by looking at the patterns seen in the posts. And then for the cultural legitimacy markers, I deductively created 10 codes, 5 positive, 5 negative, and attached them to each post in my process. And in the end, I saw the distribution of these legitimacy codes within each theme. And so, for example, if one of my themes, which was Black Cultural Foundations, was primarily made up of negative cultural legitimacy markers, then that theme would overall, have a negative impact on K-pop's cultural legitimacy. And so through that process, I did that for each theme and each post. And that was basically my entire research process and how I kind of went about kind of answering the questions that I had when I went into this project.
When people were posting about this idea of hybridity in K-pop, which, as you mentioned, the scholarly works established, like that's kind of key to it. Were they mentioning it in a positive way? Were they mentioning it in a negative way? Like how is that hybridity being discussed?
Yeah, so one of my themes is actually titled Global Hybridity. And essentially, for tweets to fall under this category, users essentially had to defend the instances, quote-unquote instances of cultural appropriation by claiming that, oh no, it's just a hybridization of K-pop. You're misunderstanding the whole process, right? That's kind of the tweets that fell under global hybridity. And so there were some tweets that kind of use hybridity as a defense tool to say like, no, this is a positive, I guess, interaction between Korean culture and Black culture, and there isn't any power dynamics in play like there is in America, right? That's some of the arguments that they made.
Okay.
But on the other hand, there were those who said that no, this isn't hybrid. This isn't the positive form of hybridity that we see in other genres. This is an kind of racially insensitive form of appropriation that takes certain Black cultural contexts and musical traditions out of their, historical context. And there was kind of like this duality between the two sides within hybridity, which I found pretty interesting.
Was there ever a moment where you came across a tweet where there was they don't even have to be necessarily a K-pop fan, but someone who is commenting on this phenomenon, who's like, you know what, this is how you do it right. Like, this is how K-pop can, borrow elements from hip-hop, but do it in a way that pays respect at the same time. Was there ever any instances of that?
I don't think there was ever a tweet that specifically laid out like an alternative, like, oh, K-pop could do X, Y, and Z, and we would all be happy.
Yeah.
But I think generally most of the tweets, or at least some of the tweets that were kind of negative towards K-pop, had kind of abstract alternatives where it's like, oh, K-pop should be more racially sensitive of these historical contexts. They should not have, they should not adapt like cornrows into their aesthetics. They should not be commercializing Black culture. So there was kind of these abstract terms, but there wasn't like a specific like X, Y, Z, do this, and we'd all be cool. Nothing like that. Yeah.
Do you think that would be helpful to, or to have that discourse be happening? Because what I'm I'm not trying to lead this conversation in this direction, and I would encourage both of you to push back if your data says otherwise. But I don't use X. I got off of X before it was X. I got off of it when it was Twitter because it's a great place to find problems with very few solutions. Like it seems like and I do value being critical, but there's I feel like for every tweet that's like, you know what, maybe a path forward where we can reconcile our differences is ABC, like, something like you're saying, like do X, Y, I don't even care, like do X, do Y, do Z, or you don't have to do any of those three things. Give me just one thing. But was that the case for the two of you where it was just kind of like criticism, but there's no like resolution in a way?
What I will say is, I've seen most of my tweets, they don't really offer solutions. It's more of a general critique. But beyond that, my tweets do sort of, I found that Twitter itself is a place where extremes are found, right? Like it doesn't represent the entire general population because people go on Twitter to complain about extreme perspectives and views from both sides. And I did note that as a limitation of my study, I can't use this study and my findings to generalize and say that the entire population believes this, because in the end, I'm only representing a very small group of people who hold these extreme views.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to get you to. I'm just looking to see if there's specific instances in your work, but there's no way either of you can really generalize because there's so many posts happening on X in a day. Some of them are made by bots. Some of them are made by people. And you can't extrapolate, but you can describe what you did see. Now, Jeffrey, you kind of just jumped in on this, but your work is about sports washing. And before we sort of shift back to the cultural legitimacy piece, because I feel like there kind of is an element of cultural legitimacy probably present in the sports washing thing. Like that's not who should be owning that soccer team.
Yeah,
they're not real soccer fans. Sorry, football fans. Football.
Yeah, get it right.
Get it right on a global scale. So for you, Jeffrey, like what is sports washing and how did you try to examine X discourse around it?
Yeah, so sports washing is the practice of utilizing sports to sort of cover up crimes or illegal practices or just negative reputation of either regimes or large corporations. And in my study, I focused on Arabian Peninsula countries and 3 specific soccer teams owned by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates.
What are those soccer teams? Just
Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester City, and Newcastle United. And I got these teams by looking at large soccer teams with a significant impact on discourse. So I gathered that by looking at teams that qualify for the 2026 Champions League. And I used this metric because the Champions League is the largest soccer tournament in Europe, and it sort of means that these teams have a large pull and sway in fan base.
And in what you saw, what seems to be the sentiment out there on X of these countries owning these teams that are obviously they're not in Qatar or the United Arab Emirates. They're in European nations. Like, are you measuring the sentiment of Western audiences or
so
just
it wasn't
anybody
necessarily sentiment? It was more like a thematic analysis. So I
gathered
themes. I gathered themes based on what they were saying.
And what are they saying?
So it surprised me, and it sort of went against most of my scholarly literature. Most people, like a vast majority of people, like 80%, are largely critiquing the act of owning a team. And I found this incredibly interesting because you wouldn't expect, based on the literature I found, most people are saying that sports washing is an incredibly effective practice. So when I was looking at the tweets, I was quite surprised to find that most tweets from English-speaking audiences specifically were critiquing the act of owning a team, and not only the act of owning a team, but the greater idea behind why these teams needed to, or why these countries needed to own these teams. So not only the act of sports washing, but why these countries needed to sports wash. So they were going into larger issues such as human rights, and they discussed a lot of geopolitical issues that you wouldn't really expect in just classic sports washing discourse.
What does classic sports washing discourse look like?
So classic sports washing discourse primarily revolves around this team, this country shouldn't own this team because they have a vested interest for financial purposes, or a vested interest meaning that they have an incredible amount of power financially because they're incredibly rich and they spend more than any other soccer team. And also beyond that, classic sports washing discourse primarily mentions themes of like nationalism, and these countries shouldn't own these teams because these teams are in our country and we should be in charge of them.
So in both of your cases, is there this idea that this group of people should not be doing this because we don't think that this is the right way to do whatever it is they're doing? I know that sounds very general, but it sounds like in your case, Jeffrey, it's like there's this fan base that's like they shouldn't own these teams, and they don't even give like to the question I asked Andrew before, like a situation of like I would be cool with who owns Manchester United?
Manchester City. Manchester
City
is
two different teams. I screwed
is
up.
Owned by the United Arab Emirates Public Investment Fund.
Okay, so I would be down with the UAE like Public Investment Fund owning Manchester City, if like do they ever give that if?
So I will say they don't really give an if, and I do think that the reason is they mention a lot of important issues that I think are very difficult to gloss over. Like they mention that Manchester City's owners are directly funding a war in Sudan and they're directly contributing to violence. And I think that just because of that, it's very difficult to offer an if just because of the reason that these countries are owning these teams.
Okay. Yeah, you want to jump in, Andrew? You had something you seem like you wanted to say.
Not really.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for my posts at least, there wasn't a general there wasn't like the reason why they didn't give an XYZ. I think is more or less because how would I say this? Like K-pop and like race as a whole, I feel like in America is a very sensitive topic. And so, we can say like abstractly, oh, like there should be more racial sensitivity. Like anyone can benefit from more racial sensitivity. But then when it comes to the actual, solutions to the observed cultural purpose, it's kind of like, what do we do? And also, I think it also stems from the fact that, hybridity exists everywhere, I feel like. Even black culture is a hybridization of a bunch of different, cultures and traditions, right? Yeah. And also, like, if you look into the history of why K-pop, or at least modern K-pop, is the way it is, it's also pretty interesting because before, like, I mentioned this in my paper, that before, hybridity in Korea was more or less the same as anywhere else, kind of just like a hybridization of cultures and an equal exchange with no like power dynamics in play that could disrupt this. But then the modern forms of cultural hybridization that K-pop is experiencing, Kim 2021 I think talks about this, is more or less is not about an equal exchange of cultures, but more about a strategic imitation of Western and American ideals that the Korean people has established within their society. And this comes from decades of colonial domination by Japan, the liberation of Korea by Western powers, and subsequently the Korean War that follows, and the heavy investment that the West made economically, politically, and militarily to Korea. And so it creates this psyche where it's like we have to be one of these Western nations, or we have to imitate these Western nations to prevent such tragedies from happening again. And this is kind of the pattern that a lot of scholarly sources are observing. And so in the 1990s, after a good few decades of economic growth South Korea suffered an economic crisis. And so this triggered the form of K-pop that we see today, where it's more or less where K-pop became this cultural exporter instead of a domestic, a form of entertainment, where it became a strategy for the Korean people to kind of exude their influence onto across the world, basically. And we see that, K-pop Demon Hunters and other forms of entertainment media.
Gonna be golden. That raises a very important point, and it's the language that you use there. So it's international entertainment. K-pop is international entertainment the same way that football is international entertainment.
Yep.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that you in your presentation, Andrew, brought up like how much of South Korea's GDP is going to be dependent on the BTS tour. It was like 7 to 10% or something like that.
I think it was I think the BTS tour. Hold up, let me see.
Because I feel like
I think it was in my mini presentation.
Yeah,
right?
it was. It was.
Let me pull it up.
I feel like everyone who's listening probably knows the cultural force that football is. It is. Yeah. It's the world's game.
Yeah.
But they may underestimate the power of K-pop as a financial driver here, because I think we're going to segue into corporate interest in a second here, and the role of sort of corporations and governments here. And so you got the band playing in the background.
Oh yeah, it's the BTS comeback concert is going to generate totally from direct tickets alone like $2 billion, and from merch sales it's going to generate $70 to $75 billion, which is around 4% of the Korean GDP. That's going to be that BTS alone is generating from one comeback tour.
All right.
So yeah.
All right.
Wow.
Now in the main there's a big variable here. Your interest, Jeffrey, is not on corporate ownership of teams. It's on governments, and governments, as you pointed out, get involved in international affairs, like you were talking about Sudan before. So then those things can be judged by the audience as good or bad, and then those problems can be, or something problematic could be pointed out. But was there anything in those tweets about how people felt about corporate powers owning these teams? Because at this point, it seems like either a corporation is going to own a team, or an individual with an intense amount of money because they basically run a corporation, or a government is going to own a team. And in your case, a lot of K-pop is run by those four big corporate.
Yeah, there's a problem, and I mentioned this because in AP seminar, a holy throwback, but I did a study on the rise of neoliberalism and how that impacted wealth inequality. And we see there in Korea, there's an economic and financial problem of a few conglomerates like Samsung, LG, or in K-pop, HYBE, JYP, who has a monopoly over their selective industries, which exacerbates the wealth inequality that we see in South Korea. And that's also an issue that a lot of people on X brought up, which is about the, I guess, kind of predatory commercialization of black culture within K-pop to kind of just support these mega conglomerates, right? And so this sentiment is not only seen, factually with I think 4 or 5 companies control about 50% of the Korean economy or something like that.
Oh wow!
But we also see it within public discourse, within international audiences, and so this kind of issue of public perception is something that I think K-pop will have to at least resolve or kind of face, which I talk about in my paper too. So
okay, yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question a little more directly, you mentioned if I saw any instances of critique of corporations in
did any of that appear?
I did see. So what was interesting is there were some tweets that defended the act of sportswashing, and the way they did this and the way I coded it with my inductive coding mechanism for my themes is I found that some pointed out the double standard of criticizing Arabian Peninsula countries when in fact Western investment by large corporations has been generally quite similar to Arabian Peninsula investment in sports, and there has been a general critique of the West and countries such as America hosting the 2026 World Cup to maybe cover up some of their negative public perception or negative international reputation. And I think it's interesting, though, the intent of these double standard tweets, because they aren't necessarily critiquing they aren't necessarily defending the act of sports washing, even though I classified it as a defense. They are more highlighting the fact that everyone is doing it, so it's unfair to mention one place or one region in the world specifically.
Let me repeat that back. So are you saying it's some tweets are like it's hypocritical to point out the sports washing because everyone uses sports as a way to make, like, basically to improve their perception globally? Yeah,
and that's one of the key findings of my research, actually, is sports isn't able to be viewed in a vacuum anymore. Sports is such a large thing around the world, and it's used in so many different ways that you can't just watch sports without taking into consideration all the geopolitical factors behind it. For example, for the Qatar 2022 World Cup, there were so many ads highlighting the great parts of Qatar, except they didn't really mention that thousands and tens of thousands of migrant workers died building stadiums in Qatar. And so I think it's really interesting that many people don't know how many people died, but you can't really view soccer anymore in just a vacuum of a sport, because you have to take into consideration all the factors behind it and the advertisements and everything you see when watching soccer.
Well, for two people who obviously weren't alive in 2006, how much do you feel that access to information at all times has made these concepts like football, soccer, and K-pop, like, I feel like for what you said, Jeffrey, you can't view anything anymore in a vacuum. Everything has this much broader context because we just can see so many more connections because there's everyone, like, it just seems like on X, there's a lot of information, but not only is there a lot of information, there's a lot of opinion. Like, do you feel like that is also a valid way of looking at this issue?
I think so, and similar to Andrew's work, I think there's definitely been a commercialization of sports, especially soccer, as a way to, well, in my case, as a way to improve international reputation. And I think it's not just to view these sports in a vacuum when you consider all the factors behind it, such as, for example, Man City's owner directly funding the war in Sudan. I think it's irresponsible to view sports without taking into greater consideration all the advertisements you see and how they're affecting you, even though you don't directly acknowledge it.
Okay.
Yeah, on to Jeffrey's point, and it's kind of not a side tangent, but yesterday I went to Costco and I saw a USA.
Which one? Which Costco?
The Costco right next to Bergen Tech.
On a Sunday, you're brave.
No, my mom had to go there, and then I saw a whole stand of USA, like the US FIFA thing,
I know exactly
with the Eagles and like the foam thing. So I just want to comment on that. It's like crazy to see. And I think Jeffrey's perspective, like after hearing it, it's like, oh, that's so obvious. Like obviously, but it's like also it's like I wouldn't have thought of it before, honestly.
Yeah.
Like,
it's pervasive. It's like obvious, but it's like if you don't stop to just notice it, you're gonna miss it.
Okay, whatever.
It's in the noise. It's just kind of out there. But it's just, do we see it? The bell's going to ring in about a minute. Actually, in about a second, because it just did. But before we go, it seems like there's this common thread here with your X analysis of people being able to point out, like, hey, we've got some issues. We've got issues. They don't exist in a vacuum. You should be aware that these are being used for, in some cases for corporate or government interests. Be critical about the entertainment you consume, to your point, Andrew. But how do you feel when, like, these problems get pointed out to you, or you notice these problems and you're just like, what can I do about this?
Yeah. So I feel like for me, I have a unique perspective on this because I'm Korean, and I feel some sort of pride towards my culture, with the fact that my culture is being enjoyed by international audiences, and it's becoming so big, right?
Sure.
And so when but I also recognize that there are issues with K-pop that has to be resolved, because there is some groups and there are some instances where there are instances of harmful cultural appropriation happening that shouldn't be, happening, right? And if I place myself in the position of, let's say, African Americans who witness this type of stuff, I feel like I would have the same kind of negative reaction. So when I see like the negative tweets or posts about K-pop, I don't get mad, but it's kind of like, okay, like this is happening. Yes, I know, but what do we do now, right? And it's kind of not. I would say like it's more like the music label's fault, and it's not. I don't know because Korea doesn't have the same racial history as the United States, and that's like, and so they don't see a problem with because 2014 talks about post-racial Asianness, where it's like Koreans and like Asian people as a whole generally kind of have a racial fluidity with their interactions with race, and so they don't see a problem with adopting historically or like culturally appropriating Black culture. They just see that as I'm just like wearing a costume or like wearing like like stereotypical pharaoh clothes for like Egyptian people, right? That's kind of like they don't see that as a problem, and so this fundamental difference of racial histories kind of I feel like makes it very complicated because you like it's easy for us to say like that's wrong, don't do that, but then when we kind of look at the solutions and we're like, oh, what should these Korean music labels do? It's kind of like they have to change their fundamental way of thinking, which is by no means saying that they shouldn't change, but it's kind of making the point that it's easy to criticize, but it's hard. To your point, also, it's hard to make the solutions that kind of last. Yeah. And I feel like, K-pop has to work on that portion, and that's what I get when I look at the criticism.
Yeah, everyone wants to feel connected and respected, I would think, on some level, and it's just, okay, we've pointed out the problem, now what do we do? Jeffrey.
Yeah, and just one final thing before we sign off. I just want to say, be critical of critiques. Don't just accept these. And I want to say,
critical of critiques. I like that.
And I want to say it's important. These critiques, a lot of the time, they don't offer solutions. So be critical of that and maybe think of ways that you can think of solutions without directly just negatively critiquing things. People critique things a lot, but they don't often come up with a solution. So it's important to not get caught up in all the negativity and all the critiques, but also acknowledge ways that you can improve the situation. There are ways to make the situation better through solutions.
I agree. I agree.
Let's end on that. All right. Thank you both.
Yep.